Cancel Sri Lanka's debt, global scholars told creditors in a document signed by some 200 economists and development experts. In the statement issued yesterday, eminent economists and scholars world over observed that amid Sri Lanka's crucial debt negotiations, all lenders, bilateral, multilateral and private, must share the burden of restructuring with the assurance of additional financing in the near term. On this note, I've invited to our studios Dr. Howard Nicholas, Sri Lankan-born economist and chief instructor at Lanka. A very warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much.
We're talking about a $2.9 billion standby arrangement with the IMF, a bailout package, and it looks like the assumption is that this $2.9 billion will bail out the country and Sri Lanka will be completely out of this crisis once that is disbursed. But how do you look at this, especially in a backdrop where, like I just said, 200 scholars and economists have signed a document asking lenders to look at this in a favorable way?
Well, first and foremost, I'd like to say that the 2.9 billion is not going to solve Sri Lanka's problems, and I don't think the IMF is claiming that either. Rather, what they're claiming is it'll unlock the door for more borrowing by Sri Lanka. Now, I think that's where Sri Lanka is going to compound the problems they currently have with yet more problems. And I would not recommend going down that road. As many people know, what I've recommended in the past is tackling the most fundamental problem. For 40 plus years, we have had a monster trade deficit, one of the largest in the world. Every year, it's in excess of 10% of GDP. So all the time, it's an accident waiting to happen. So the accident has happened in the past. We've gone to the IMF in the past. They've come with structural adjustment packages. And we're back to where we were before because we haven't tackled the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is not going to be tackled by the sorts of policies they're recommending and which the Sri Lankan government is acceding to. So I would say, yes, short term, we need to tighten the belt. And there the IMF can help us because they are not only talking about how the belt can be tightened, but relief for the poorer sections of the society in that context, which is new for the IMF. They haven't spoken about that before, and I think that's very encouraging. But what I would like to say is that we still need to put into place structural policies that remedy that fundamental trade imbalance if we're going to progress further.
Specifically on the debt restructuring process, Dr. Nicholas, what do you propose? How do you propose Sri Lanka approach this? We've been talking about obtaining creditor assurances, and now economists are also pressing that amidst this crucial time that lenders and creditors look at Sri Lanka's situation favorably. But how should we approach this?
Well, actually, I'm not an expert on that. I mean, my concern has been, since I've come here, and I think I mentioned this to you, some of the conditions that the IMF is imposing on Sri Lanka, and I'm worried about them. You know, one of those is the reform of the Monetary Law Act. And I'm very worried about that because, firstly, there's absolutely, in my view, no theoretical or empirical substance for this reform. It's based on a discarded, outmoded theory, and yet we seem to be the experiment ground for the IMF. Now, I would like them to come up with some substance to justify what they're recommending. In a nutshell, they're actually going to prevent the central bank from fulfilling the obligations of all central banks in the world, and that is the provision of liquidity. If they do that, next time we're hit by any sort of global shock, the buffers are off. In other words, the budget cannot be used as a buffer, and money printing cannot be used as a buffer. Let me just explain that. It's not only Sri Lanka that ran a huge budget deficit in 2021. every country in the world ran one. So, you know, if you like, everybody resorted to the same type of economic policy. That is normal when any country is hit with a shock. That's exactly what the government should do. However, this Monetary Law Act will prevent the government doing that. If the government then runs a budget deficit, the economy will be hammered by very high interest rates. And we're not talking of 30%. We could be looking at 40% or even 50% on treasury bills, one-year treasury bills.
Are you saying this will push Sri Lanka from bad to worse if we face budgetary concerns? And also you did mention that this is a theory that is outdated and discarded by the Western world.
By the West. So let me just give you the example. Before he died, one of the architects of this theory, Milton Friedman, actually said that he now doesn't believe there is this link between money and expenditure, money and inflation. Okay, so that's just before he died. Secondly, in the mid-1990s, the central banks of the Western countries said, you can neither target the cash base of the system, nor can you control it. So in other words, the Western countries actually have given up on targeting money supply. And that was confirmed in 1995 when the chairman of the Federal Reserve, in testimony to the US Congress, said that the Federal Reserve doesn't even look at money supply figures when they set interest rates. So I'm bewildered. I don't understand what the IMF is telling Sri Lanka and where they're getting the substance for telling Sri Lanka. So I would issue a challenge to the IMF. Show us the data. I know they don't have the data because we have done comprehensive studies showing there is no such relationship that they're alluding to. So I issue this challenge directly to the IMF. Please show me the data.
We'd like to take this conversation forward, but before we wrap up this discussion, what do you think Sri Lanka's stand should be if you say this is not what the IMF should be advising Sri Lanka to do?
Well, I think there should be a discussion, a debate, and Sri Lanka should just ask the IMF to please give us some evidence, you know, because what happens today is people don't provide evidence.
But do you think there is an alternative for Sri Lanka at this point?
Well, you see, you can't just impose things on a country with no rationality. You know, there must be some rationality and some logic so that they can then sell it to the public. You know, if there is no rationality and logic, let's assume that we're hit with another shock, as we all expect now, and interest rates soar, and we get a real financial crisis in this country, the government cannot turn around and say, well, sorry, we even discussed this and had open discussions and debates and so on, because there has been no discussion. And that's what worries me. I mean, maybe in the end we go down this road, but there should be an open discussion, and the IMF should be asked to justify this policy recommendation.
How do you forecast Sri Lanka's short to mid-term recovery?
Well, of course, everyone in the now has got on board with the idea that 2023 is going to be a bad year for the global economy. So Sri Lanka cannot expect to recover unless the global economy recovers. Obviously, this means to say we'll have more pain. But going beyond that, maybe if we recognize that the elephant in the room I mentioned, the trade imbalance, is the real problem that we have to cope with, maybe we'll actually start to do something about that, instead of actually just using sticking plaster everywhere.
I'd like to invite you once again to discuss further, but thank you very much for sharing your thoughts here at Hyde Park, and you of course extended a challenge to the IMF as well. We look forward to discussing further on this. We had with us Dr. Howard Nicholas, Sri Lankan-born economist, international economist, who is also the chief instructor at AdaDerana Lanka, joining us to talk about alternative solutions to Sri Lanka's crisis and the way forward in dealing with the International Monetary Fund.